Glass Ceiling was the first play that I have written, and it was in 2006. I suppose the immediate cause was my mother's death. So I wanted to write something that would honor really both of my parents, and since they both had left me by that point, it seemed a really appropriate time to do that. Now, there was some other, in a way, mechanical reasons. I was coming up to my 60th birthday, and my last work as a full-time broadcaster. And I wanted somehow to get back into the theater. I had started life as an actor and then had about a 30-year gap when I was a broadcaster and a journalism educator. And I'm not knocking these things. I loved all of my jobs. But I thought, okay, who is going to hire a 60-year-old black woman who has not been acting for 30 years? The answer is nobody. So I probably better write my own play. And I was in Winnipeg at that moment, and in the audience of the Winnipeg Fringe Festival, Theatre Fringe Festival. And the Winnipeg Festival is wonderful. It's lots of audience, and everybody, whether young or mature, participates in the Winnipeg Fringe. I saw a one-woman show about Edith Piaf, and I thought, okay, I could do that. I could write a one-woman show essentially about my parents and what they have taught me or given me, and I will apply to the Fringe and see what happens. So I entered. Theatre Fringe festivals are a lottery. You just toss your name in, and your name is drawn or it isn't. And my name was drawn, so that gave me a deadline. The other factor, so I said my mother had recently died. I suppose I used the kind of insomnia and continual processing that people have in a grief situation to write the play. So I would wake up. I had a very responsible day job. I was Director of News and Current Affairs at APTN, Aboriginal People's Television Network. I would get up before I needed to do my preparations for work and make sure that I had written at least a page of the play that I was intending to write. So that's a long way of saying I was in a grief situation. The play is essentially to honor my parents. I had the hot breath of deadline because my name was drawn in the Winnipeg Fringe Festival, and I wanted to do something to kickstart my return to the theater, and so that meant writing my own play. I would say that I never said, I am a playwright, this is what I am doing now. In part because I'm married to a playwright, and I wondered how he would take my suddenly deciding to write plays after being married for 40-something years. He took it just fine, he didn't have a problem. But I really was trying to do something that would get me back into those circles that would, and when I was an actor 1,000 years ago, actors didn't make their own work as much as they do now. So I was also going with the trends of the time. McCarthy and the Old Woman. Oh, so the other thing is I got caught in my own publicity. Since I was a news director, when I first went into the Fringe Festival, This, of course, caught the attention of the reviewers and the people who were writing about the festival. So I said, my retirement plan is to come to the Winnipeg Fringe once a year for 5 years. So that's my plan between the ages of 60 and 65, which meant I had to stick with that because it got quite a lot of ink, this retirement plan. McCarthy and the Old Woman, however, is a completely different matter. I met a woman named Florence James when I was an actor only at the Globe Theatre in Regina in 1971. She literally was a very elderly, white-haired, white woman sitting in the back of the rehearsal hall when we were rehearsing. And I had no idea who she was. Occasionally, she would tell us to speak up. And I thought, is something wrong with my diction? I was very worried because this was my first union job as an actor. And the job was very important to me. So I thought she's being critical in some way or other. Through a whole series of steps, I found out her history. This was about, let's say 4 years later, when I had fallen into broadcasting and bought my own audio recording equipment, and the artistic director of the theater said, record Florence's memories before she forgets everything. And I didn't know what she had to forget. Her story in brief, and it's almost hard to tell the story in brief, is that she and her husband founded the Seattle Repertory Company in Seattle, Washington in 1928 and ran it successfully until 1948 when they were blacklisted by the Washington State Committee on Un-American Activities. Florence, their theater building was expropriated, the husband died, they were bankrupt, everything you can name went wrong. And she immigrated to Saskatchewan, where she was the first drama consultant of the Saskatchewan Arts Board, which is why she was sitting in the back of the rehearsal hall when I was a 26-year-old actress. What caught my attention when I'm recording all of this audio tape with this very elderly woman who is almost blind is she dropped into the conversation that during the Depression they had had a black theater company in Seattle called the Negro Repertory Company. And since I was a black actor, and I knew how difficult this was, that's what attached me to the story when I was 30-something, that this was amazing and radical, and I asked her. Actually, at first I didn't believe it. I had to go to Seattle and go through her archives to realize that this was not only true, but that this Negro Repertory Company had been an outstanding company. The U.S. did something that may appear very strange with hindsight, which is that it financed the arts better during the Depression than ever before or since. Because suddenly they were worried about putting people in jobs, and artists were among the people that they put in jobs where they had never put them in jobs before. So that's how this, but why my woman, Florence James, had started this company was, of course, what I was most interested in. So that was what attached me to the story. Then I had a 25-30-year career as a broadcaster and had to put the story on the shelf while I worked 16-hour days and did daily shows and all of these things. So when I came out of that, and by now I'm 60 something, I thought the fastest way for me to get this story out there is to write a one-woman show, because I don't have to have a lot of people saying, yes, you're going to do this. No company has to decide to produce it. So that's what I did. I wrote the one-woman show called McCarthy and the Old Woman, and that meant that I was playing this elderly white woman, Florence James, and this young black journalist who was trying to get information from her. And the play was a wonderful hit. Everybody loved it. It harkened back to an era that actually the people who came to see the play who were old enough to remember the Cold War and McCarthyism naturally stayed and talked to me about their stories. What was a surprise were the young people who were 30-something who stayed to talk to me because they thought the play was about the repression of their era. We're talking post 9/11, we're talking all kinds of right-wing pressure that people are experiencing. So they thought I had reached back for this historic incident to tell the story of 2007. And that wasn't actually what I had done. This hadn't been in my mind at all. But once it was pointed out to me, of course, I thought, okay, this is really important because it's got messages in it that are important to people from ages 25 to 90. What attached to me when I was 60-something was that this woman, after she was completely ruined by any definition you want to come up with, started an entirely new, successful life when she was over 60. And I thought, women will love this, everybody will love it, because we always say it's too late to do whatever. And it wasn't too late for her. She changed countries. She went from a highly civilized place in Seattle with a mild climate to Saskatchewan with a very rude climate. But Saskatchewan had decided to have an arts board and to support the arts. And she said, I'm there. And she flourished. Yes, yes. And so that was 2007, 2008 that I did the play. I did, in fact, a benefit performance for the grandmothers, the Stephen Lewis grandmothers in Don Mills, because the grandmothers wanted to raise money for the grandmothers in Africa. And so I donated a performance of the play. It was sold out. And here again, the different ways people connected with the story. And even since the grandmothers are that age, the idea that you could do something that was very important after you became elderly was something that worked for them. So the one-woman show wasn't the only thing I did with the story. Later, I wrote a full-length play with the same title, and to my great delight, that play was produced by the School of Drama at the University of Washington in Seattle. And the significance of that was that meant it was in the same theater building that was taken from my people, from Florence James and her husband. So it was the same theatrical space. And all of her grandchildren and their partners and ex-partners and her great-grandchildren came to see the play. It was sponsored by the University Women's Club because of its huge feminist messages, and it was sold out every night, and that was splendid. So, full-length play, McCarthy and the Old Woman. Then there was a short for Bravo Fact about the same themes. And finally, just a couple of years ago, we managed to get Florence's own book published. She had written her own memoir called Fist Upon a Star. And when a number of us in Saskatchewan tried to get the book published in the 80s, nobody would touch it. Nobody literally would touch it. Then the University of Regina Press got a wonderful new publisher. His name is Bruce Walsh, a young man, and he looked at this book and he said, this book is splendid. I'm going to publish this. So I wrote the 8,000-word epilogue to the book because Florence stopped her own memoir when she left the United States. So we needed a little bit about Saskatchewan and about Canada. The book has won awards, and in 2015, it was published in paperback in Canada and the United States. It's no accident when I say this is a wonderful new publisher. Obviously, I think he's wonderful because he published my book. But he also, his taste is evident. He's also the publisher of Clearing the Plains, which is the work about the purposeful starvation of Aboriginal peoples, which made a huge news story when the book was published. And he has just published The Education of Augie Morasti, which is a book that was written by a homeless Aboriginal man and brought to him by a professor at the University of Regina. So he is obviously getting into those deep stories that come from the prairies and Canadian history. I should also say that Florence's own book was co-authored or ghost-written by a woman named Jean Freeman, who is, she's the old lady in the Corner Gas series. And so Florence taught Jean when Jean was a teenager. She taught her drama. And Jean is a wonderful actor, wonderful writer. And by the time Florence got around to writing her memoir, she was almost blind. So literally, Jean assisted her in writing this book that no one would publish in the 80s. My mother truly taught me by example that when you face a barrier, your job is not to say, ain't it awful, here's a barrier, I'm going to die. Your job at that point is to figure out how you can get around or over or through the barrier, because then you're the winner. You don't punish the other people. Now, actually, I didn't figure this out as a child. This has taken me a long while to figure out who suffers when you give up. You suffer. It's not the other, it's not the racist and the sexist who suffer. The only thing I would add is not only have we not gotten over these things, there was a window in the 80s and 90s where a lot more people were being given voice. that was a real window. It wasn't an illusion. However, in the 2000s, that window, those windows many of them have closed. I wrote a statement only yesterday, since Ontario is presently looking at its cultural strategies, to call attention to how professional artists are totally not mentioned in the strategy. And I don't know where they think these other things come from. Where does the education of children or the participation of citizens in arts come from if you don't have a structure of professional artists who work in all of the arts? And they can miss this because it's gotten worse. There is the illusion. It's like the illusion that you can have medical services available to everyone without Medicare. Somehow, things that we have, we think things can keep on in the same way if you remove those things. And that's not very bright. So we have to have not-for-profit broadcasting. We have to have support of the arts. We have to have support of artists of diversity working in the arts. We have to have support of women working in the arts. All of those things have to be conscious in order for them to happen. But as soon as we get a little bit of the way, it's a little bit like the National Film Board saying they didn't need Studio D anymore because women would be in everything. Well, we see how well that worked. It didn't. So you start to take for granted things that are working slightly well and get rid of them. And that, I think, is what is happening right now. I was very recently on a panel. My mother's lifelong philosophy of what I am denied, I will build myself, is something I have increasingly, as I have gotten older, incorporated into my own way of living. It's also what I try to teach people. So I said to the audience at the panel, though, that something rather strange has started to happen to me recently, I'd say in the last couple of years, that when I express these philosophies of if you can't work with these people, find some people you can work with. If nobody is going to build it but you, then build it. That when I say these kinds of things, recently, mainly younger women, although sometimes older ones, mainly women of color, though sometimes not of color, will look at me and say, well, what you've just said is all very well and good, but you know, there's racism and sexism in the world. And I told the senior artist, I've been so stunned by this comment that I haven't known what to say. But I have decided that the next time this comes up, I'm going to say, you know, dear, I've noticed that. What do you think I'm talking about? I've not only noticed that, but since I was born in 1945 in Houston Negro Hospital, I've experienced a good deal of this racism and sexism that you seemingly have just discovered. What I'm talking about is how you get around it, through it, over it, which I think is a phrase that I use in Smoke Glass Ceiling. So literally, I don't know why. Maybe I don't look scarred enough. Maybe I don't look defeated enough. Is that why in the last couple of years, younger women have started to say this to me as if they've literally just discovered it? As if it's something you have only to know the history of the world just a little bit to know that, yeah, I know that. There are some good things happening now. Those things are mainly related to Aboriginal peoples, and thank goodness they are. Because since I worked for APTN for a while, this is very much on my mind. An Aboriginal People's Television Network was the last to be licensed. The first peoples were the last to be licensed. In a way, that says it all. And my worry, now that the not-for-profit sector has all but disappeared, is that APTN will be so popular that the for-profit guys who own everything will want to own it as well. This is very dangerous because what makes it successful is that it is owned, managed, and controlled by Aboriginal peoples who have definitely found their voice. And as long as the country, and in this sense, a change in political leadership is very important, because the present Prime Minister is reversing all of those no's that the previous government said, no, we will not have an inquiry into murdered and missing Aboriginal women. No, we will not sign the UN Declaration on Rights for Indigenous Peoples. So the current government is reversing that, and it's a very good moment. It may even be a good moment for people of color. It may even be a good moment for women. So there's the gender parity and I'm not saying this as a partisan statement. It's not that I think the Liberal Party is great and I was busy painting myself in liberal colors during the election. But actions talk. And so starting that inquiry for missing and murdered Aboriginal women is significant. Signing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is significant. Gender parity in the cabinet is significant. There is a cabinet committee on inclusion and diversity. That's significant. So there is a bit of, there are windows that are opening at this moment. How far they will open, how long they will stay open, but all of this is in fact cyclical. So I hope it means a great deal. Yes, your identity is in many ways everything. You can't be anyone else other than who you are. When I first became aware that people couldn't hear what I had to say unless they knew where I was from, I started to tell them where I was from off the top so they could hear what else I had to say. That's when I first started to say I was born in 1945 in Houston Negro Hospital, and I have been black and a woman ever since. That's the answer to all of their questions. However, sometimes I do forget this. And one of my main incidents, I used to participate quite actively in the Canadian Association of Journalists. when there was a quite active Canadian Association of Journalists, and it tells you something about the shrinking of that profession, that that's no longer such a big interest group. However, in any case, I used to participate quite vigorously, and I was always asked at their annual conventions to be on a panel about something that had to do with visible minority concerns. And so a convention came up in Ottawa, and I knew the two organizers quite well. And I popped off at them. I said, I want to be on the same panels as everybody else. I'm concerned about libel and slander and access to information and good writing and whatever else everybody. So don't pigeonhole me on these visible minority panels, I said to my friends. So they said, okay. And about a month later, they called me up about organizing a panel. And this is when a number of people were just starting to be fired. News organizations were starting to shrink, and people were just starting to be on the streets. And so they said, you've had a lot of experience with freelancing, so we want you to be part of a panel called When the Going Gets Tough, the Tough Get Going. And I said, oh, fine, I'm happy to do that. And then when I actually got around to preparing what I was going to say, as I said to the audience, I realized that everything I had to say was as a result of being a black woman. Even though I had not been asked to talk, what I know about when the going gets tough, the tough get going, is because I have never expected to be looked after by some institutionalized structures that would employ me for the rest of my life. I have always had to start things. I've always had to, well, I just told you that when I said I want to get back in the theater, I knew no one was going to hire me. I didn't have to knock on 100 doors and be turned down to find that out. It was perfectly obvious and logical. A 60-year-old black woman who hadn't been acting for 30 years was not going to get hired. So I needed to make my own work. So I had to admit that everything comes from your identity, even when I was trying to deny it, which I was in the case of that particular convention. I will say something else. Since I am living through these years where younger women are telling me that there's sexism and racism in the world, when I say I was born in 1945 in Texas, that means I was born and lived through the Civil Rights era. Texas was an extremely racist state. It still has its moments. However, Texas would be acknowledged as one of the more racist of the southern states. I went to segregated schools throughout to the end of high school. And although the desegregation acts had been passed by the time I graduated from high school, Texas managed to find ways not to integrate the schools. So I went to completely segregated schools to the end of high school. The Texas that I grew up in essentially had segregated housing, segregated public facilities, segregated schools. And in spite of that, the wonderful parents that I have talked about managed to teach me life lessons that were extremely helpful. It's also that I was extremely fortunate. So all of these bad things were happening. All of these bad things were happening. However, I had two parents who were highly intelligent, got the best educations they could get at the time, were employed, got a mortgage, owned a house, and believed that my having a wonderful education was the best thing they could give me, and they worked very hard to make that possible. So in many ways, I was extremely privileged because I had all of these examples and this enrichment and this love and protection until I was old enough to face the real world like it is. It was a very privileged and fortunate environment that I was protected by. One of the things that I try to teach people is that privilege is not bad. When you have privilege, usually with classes, I, very near the beginning of the class, ask the students to figure out ways in which they are advantaged and ways that they are disadvantaged. And they discover most things that people discover, that sometimes an advantage and a disadvantage are the same thing. They, of course, discover things about race and gender and education and so on. And then comes the real lesson, that your job is not to say, oh, I don't have those privileges, or I don't have that power. Your job is to use it for something. And if you have it and somebody else doesn't, then your job is to pass it on and not use all of your energy saying, I'm really not privileged. And this is almost a harder lesson for people of color than it is for white people. Because people of color are so accustomed to not having privilege and power that when we get it, and many of us do, we don't know that we're supposed to use it for something. We're not supposed to keep saying, I don't have that. So I point out some very basic things. If you're a university student, that's already a privilege. If you're sitting in this room, that's already a privilege. So what are you going to do now? At this moment, I think Canada is in a very good position to be a more inclusive society for two reasons. One is the recognition of Aboriginal peoples and the problems that we have caused historically up to the present with Aboriginal peoples. I think more people are aware of this at this moment than they ever have been before. So that's one good moment we're in. The second good moment we're in is the 25,000 Syrian refugees, which many people are involved in sponsoring or in supporting in some way. Many of the people who are involved in the sponsoring and supporting come from a whole variety of backgrounds. They have great diversity in their own history, and they are working together to sponsor the Syrian refugees. So we have two moments where the main things that you need for inclusion are happening. That is, you don't need to spend a lot of time talking about how you are different. You need to agree on some things that need to be done, regardless of your differences. And these two things are very practical. And that's the way inclusion happens, is you agree on some task that need to be done. So I think we're in a good moment. Now, how long the moment will last, I can't say. I've had 2 travel experiences recently that have something to say about this topic. We're very bad in Canada at admitting our problems. If we have a racism problem, we're very bad at admitting that. I believe that the former Prime Minister said that Canada did not have a colonial past, which is an extraordinary statement. So I've fairly recently, been to Germany. Now, I avoided Germany for most of my adult life. I couldn't imagine why I wanted to go there. I said, these are the people who had Nazis. Why do I need to go there? There's nothing to be gained by my going to Germany. Well, now, a number of my friends told me I was wrong. And in fact, when I got the opportunity, I knew a professor who taught German, and he made a long list of places I needed to go and things I needed to do. But the thing that astonished me the most, actually the most, was how good they are at admitting their past. All of the museums, all of the curricula, everything is geared to this was awful and we're not going to do it again. So I think it's no accident that in the case of the Syrian refugees, that it was Germany that was ready to say, we're doing this, compared to the rest of the people in Europe. So that's one travel experience that's been important. So I was wrong. There's lots to be learned from Germany. The second was to South Africa, which is not a perfect place. However, I toured I was on a trade mission. Canadian film and television people going to film and television places so South Africa could court our business. So we were in lots of workplaces, lots of film and television, sound stages, and other aspects of the business. And one of the things I encountered while I was there was that South Africa has something they call historically disadvantaged individuals, HDI. And if a workplace provides work and training for historically disadvantaged individuals, they get a bonus. So all I'm flagging is the admission that there are such people. Everybody talks about it. Everybody admits that there are historically disadvantaged individuals. If we were to come up with that concept and stop arguing about whether there are or aren't, and we all know that at least Aboriginal peoples, peoples of color, persons with disabilities, and women may be historically disadvantaged individuals. This is not rocket science, yet we spend a lot of time arguing about whether it's the case. So I don't know if we have to be as dramatic as Nazi Germany and apartheid South Africa to admit these basic problems. So I think we're closer to a moment where we're admitting it. And maybe we can have all of those plans to correct the situation. Harmonious race relations are usually dependent on first recognizing that there is a problem. Second, evaluating your own privilege and power and gifts, since they're different for every person. And then figuring out how you're going to use the privilege and power and gifts to work with other people. So what I just said sounds very brief, but it's not at all simple, but it can be practiced. It can always be practiced. And that's how I think we make things more inclusive. We figure out what we have to contribute, and most everybody has got something. Some of us have got a lot, some of us have a little, but in the circumstance, it's all needed. So that's what we do. Canada is rightly proud of many things in our history. And many of these things have been said recently, that historically we are peacekeepers instead of makers of war. That historically we believe in a social safety net, medical care and education for everybody at the public's expense, libraries at the public's expense. So we need to affirm all of those things. We don't need to affirm our denial and keep talking about it. And I think there are lots of signs at this moment that we're getting out of our denial. We also have an ability, I think, more than many societies, and there are reasons for this, for people who are not alike to coexist quite well. And we're getting practice at it at the moment. I had a very serious conversation with one of my friends who wanted me to understand that all of the Syrian refugees might not be nice people who will contribute beautifully to Canadian society, and that this was a real danger. And so I finally said, so is the answer not to let in any Syrian refugees? My friend wasn't so sure about that. But the other thing is, I said, so name a group of people in Canadian history who have all been 100% wonderful and have contributed wonderfully to Canadian society. Who is this group? Aren't there bad apples in every group you can name? We can't stop building the country because a group has some bad apples. We don't need to be naive about it either. But all we can do is build the country that we want to have happen, and take reasonable precautions to find the bad apples.